God could be referred to in non-gendered terms during Church of England services for the first time. Breaking with centuries of tradition, bishops have announced they are launching a major project on gendered language this spring. It may suggest that priests can stop using the male pronouns he and him when referring to God in some prayers, or even that they can drop the famous phrase, Our Father, from the start of the Lord's Prayer. However, such a radical rewriting would have had to be agreed by by the Church's governing body, the General Synod, and would be fiercely resisted, of course, by traditionalists for breaking away from the words of the Bible. So joining me now to discuss this, I have Martine Oborne, Chair of Women and the Church, and Gavin Ashenden, former chaplain to Queen Elizabeth II. Thanks for joining me. Gavin Ashenden, I'm going to come to you first. So what's so wrong with the idea of perceiving or conceiving of God as gender neutral?
I think part of the problem is that every time we change our language, we change the philosophy or the ideas. Language and ideas are bound very closely together. I mean, for example, you said, what about calling God them? So that takes us into polytheism. If you think there's more than one God, you have to use they. The idea of using he, or God's favorite chosen personal pronoun, suggests that it's different from either the worship of goddesses or many gods, and so it fulfills a particular descriptive function.
Martine Oborne, can I ask you about this? Is it not the case that this feels very much like the Church of England is sort of bringing in these very voguish concerns, these ideological concerns that really are very ephemeral and probably we won't even be talking about in 30, 40 years' time? Why are we doing this?
Well, I don't think it's about the Church of England trying to be very woke or anything like that. I think it's important for two. Well, first of all, it's very biblical to think of God as a mother as well as a father. And God is not a man. And getting over this idea that God is a rather clumsy and lazy idea, that we believe somehow in God being a little old man sitting on a cloud up in the sky. I think anything that helps us see that God is beyond gender, I think, is very important. And in the Bible, we're told that God creates humankind in his image, male and female. He creates them. The metaphor of father is very important, and no one is talking about getting rid of the metaphor of father in reference to God. And no one's actually talking about changing the words of the Lord's Prayer. But as I understand it, the project is about looking at maybe some additional ways and when we might refer to as God as mother. There are lots in scripture, talks about God giving birth to his people, talks about God comforting his people like a mother. It's not a woke thing. It's about giving a better reflection of who God is. And also there is something about how women and girls do struggle with an image of God being presented to them that seems male, male, male. And so having a truer and more inclusive representation of God in our liturgy, I think could be very helpful.
Well, it's interesting. Can I come to you, Gavin Ashenden, about that? Because the reporting on this in the press has very much been making the case that the name Our Father would change, that God would be referred to not with he or him pronouns. So is Martine Oborne right that, in fact, that's not the case here?
No, I don't think she is, I'm afraid, because the American Anglicans have been up doing this for about 25 years. So we know what the trajectory looks like. It's, as you say, it's a trajectory that accommodates itself to the culture. And unfortunately, particularly nowadays, actually toxic masculinity has been imposed upon Christianity as well. And so the notion of fatherhood has become quite repellent to some people. And the prayer's already been changed colloquially. People talk about creator, sustainer in spirit to avoid the masculinity of the Trinity. So that's already happening. And I think the difference is that traditionalists want to use religion in a way that works best. I mean, looking back over 2,000 years, what's been good, what's been bad? Let's avoid the bad and use the best. The problem with this particular movement is, as you say, it's trendy, woke, accommodating itself to a culture that's in real trouble in terms of the way it understands sex and identity and mental stability. So there's a very good reason for sticking with what works rather than adopting the anarchy of our present circumstances.
Reverend Oborn, can I put that to you in terms of this idea of our Father as a metaphor? That was a word that you used. You acknowledge that this is a metaphor. The people who are praying to God as our Father understand that they are not literally saying that he's a father in that sense, and that God is more than that. So really, what's the harm?
No harm at all. And there's absolutely no suggestion that the Lord's Prayer is going to be changed. The only thing that's been announced is that there's a project to look at gendered language in relation to God, which might lead to some additional prayers being authorized alongside existing prayers. And there's absolutely no suggestion that anyone's going to start rewriting the Lord's Prayer, which would be inappropriate because actually it's the words, as best we know, that Jesus gave to his disciples for that particular prayer.
So, Gavin Ashenden, if it is the case that the Church is simply implementing new prayers to go alongside the traditional prayers, why would that be a problem?
Oh, well, I was an Anglican for 40 years and sat on the General Synod for 20. Every one of these changes begins with the promise we're just going to do a little bit of tinkering, and we promise you, A, nothing much will change, and B, if you don't like it, you can stay. And every single time the promise has been broken, there have been serious changes, and then people who didn't like it were driven out. So that I mean, there's no reason for thinking that's not going to happen again.
I mean, it's certainly the case, isn't it, that the Church of England is currently perceived, irrespective of what has been said tonight, it is very much perceived as being on the woke side, and it's perceived as doing a lot of kind of gesture politics in that direction. Is it not the case, Martin Oborn, that the Church should really be staying out of these kind of cultural disputes?
I mean, let me just say that we already have a Eucharistic prayer, Prayer G, authorized, which refers to God gathering his people like a mother. And also, not just references to God as mother in the Bible, but theologians over the whole history of Christian tradition have referred to as God as mother. I mean, medieval theologians like Julian of Norwich in the 14th century said God is our mother as truly as he is our father. It's not wokeism. It's doing two important things. One, helping us to get away from a very unhelpful idea that Christians believe that God's a man sitting on a cloud. And two, very helpful to have language that is less excluding for women and girls who, when they come to faith, are being presented with a God who is male, male, male. And
so can I just ask, is it your contention then that if the woke movement did not exist, I mean, we're not having these discussions, the Church would be implementing these new policies anyway?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back right to the Bible, this understanding of God as mother, as well as God as father. As I say, the Bible talks about God giving birth to his people. It talks about him having a womb in some parts. So, you know, the language is there. I admit that, you know, there are far more references to father and God as a father. Although having said that, in Genesis, at one point, God refers to himself as we. He talks about having created humanity in our image. So, you know, there's that as well. But I mean,
can I come to you, Gavin Ashenden, about that? Are you persuaded, off the back of what Martin Oborn has said, that actually this is entirely divorced from the notion of wokeism and that we would be having these conversations anyway as a matter of course?
Well, it isn't. I mean, Martin's quite right in saying that the issues of gender philosophically are really quite complex. And she's given some examples of where, of course, there's femininity and masculinity. Of course there is. But the way the Church of England intends to do it is essentially driven by politics. If it was driven by theology and by practice and by the Church's experience, it would be far more nuanced. And it was the kind of thing we could have a conversation about properly. But this is a political movement. It's intended to drive out masculinity, give a preference to femininity. I don't think a little old lady on a cloud is any better than a little old man on a cloud. One of the things we have to do is be a bit more sophisticated about the way we use gender. And we should keep it out of a political struggle, and especially out of the woke wars.
And why is it that you think, Gavin Ashenden, that the Church of England seems to be susceptible to the woke movement? You would have thought that a traditionalist body, such as the Church of England, would be the one place where these things wouldn't infect.
Well, I became a Catholic partly in response to the way in which the Church of England was becoming incoherent in what it believed. And one of the things Catholics have found is that the Latin Mass it has becoming one of the most popular ways of approaching God and saying our prayers. And I think what we're finding is that the sort of the slippery surface of our current culture is alarming for a lot of people. And what they want is handholds that work. And so that's one of the reasons. But the Church of England is essentially a liberal and experimental body, and that can be a very good thing in certain circumstances. But just at the moment, it's actually a bad thing, and it won't serve them very well.
OK, final word to you, Martin Oborn, if you would.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when people started calling female policemen police officers, and we started to use that language, and or we started to say chair rather than chairman. And at the time, quite a lot of people were like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Women understand that it includes them. Language does matter, and it can be very excluding. I'm glad that we don't expect women to all think of themselves as policemen. We've changed language in this way. It's a more accurate reflection of God to show that God is beyond gender, that he's not an old man on the sky, neither is he an old woman sitting up in the sky. And if we can get away from that language, I think that's helpful. And if we can be more missional and inclusive in our language, I think that's all for the good.
Well, thank you both ever so much for offering your perspectives. Thank you very much.